One of the reasons Putin has been giving for invading Ukraine, he's been saying, "Они мои люди," which means they are my people. He thinks in his brain, and I don't know if he believes this or if he's lying, he thinks that the Ukrainians are in fact true Russians and that he has a right to invade because they belong to Russia. That's not exactly true. The Ukraine has a long history of being torn between East and West, and you know, of course, that they were a part of the USSR for a while, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Ukrainian history today, the history of the people, why this tug of war has been going on over Ukraine, and why Russia and Putin especially thinks that it's his. So do you want to hear a little bit of history of Ukraine? Let's get started. Hi, my name is Carolyn, and in case you just happened to land here by accident because you saw the title and you didn't follow me from my other channel, let me explain. You're like, who is this weird looking lady talking about politics as if she knows anything? So I live full-time in an RV, and my main channel is Carolyn's RV Life, living full-time in an RV. I decided almost 6 years ago to leave the rat race and live remotely and be a nomad and see the country. But I also love politics. I'm a political junkie. I have a degree from Berkeley in political economy of industrial societies. I studied Russia, and I remember in one of my early As I See It videos, somebody stumbled on and said, what did he say? Oh, now I've seen everything, an RVer who thinks she knows everything. And it's like, well, I don't think I know everything, but just because I live in an RV does not erase my knowledge and education. If that's you, welcome, and thank you for being here, and I hope you'll subscribe. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Ukraine, and why, I don't know, why Putin is saying that they are Russian people, and that gives him the right to invade them and kill them and murder them and slaughter them so that he can take over the country. As you know, the Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, right? And I'm going to kind of work up to that in a minute. And then when Yeltsin disbanded pretty much the Soviet Union in 1991, the Ukraine declared their independence, and they have been an independent nation ever since. So now Putin's like, no, you're mine. And they're like, dude, no, we're just not into you. We broke up with you. Just leave us alone. And he's like, no, but you're mine. And they're like, dude, we're just not that into you. The area that we know today as the modern-day Ukraine actually dates back to an area known in medieval times as Kievan Rus. Kiev, which is the capital of modern-day Ukraine, and Rus, which is the root for Russia. At the time, it was inhabited by Scandinavian traders, who some say are the namesakes of modern-day Russians. Over time, you know how Europe history, if you've ever studied European history or ancient history, the Cossacks took over the Mongols, and then the Tartars came in, and then Russia was Poland, and Poland was Russia. I mean, I'm joking, of course, but borders get moved and shifted, and countries get owned by other countries, and the Habsburg Empire came over, and they took over this and that. I mean, so it's very, very complicated, and I'm not going to get into all the details because I don't think the details really matter. I think the big picture here is that the Ukraine is a border state. So early on in the history of Kievan Rus, they were occupied first by the Scandinavians, and then the Polish and the Lithuanians came in, and they took over for a little while. And then after they had it for a little while, then all of a sudden the Russians came in, and they took part of it for a little while. The challenge that Ukraine has always had is that it is a border country, bordering Eastern Europe, Russia, which has its own imperialistic goals, and then bordering the countries of Europe, which also had their imperialistic goals too throughout European history. The problem or the challenge that any border country faces is that you're going to have split alliances. Your country's going to be divided in allegiances within your own population. There's going to be a diverse population. There's going to be a difference of opinion about whether, at least in Ukraine's case, are we a Western European country or are we Eastern? Are we Russian? Are we Eastern European? And the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian country definitely experienced that throughout its history. While the residents, while the citizens on the western side felt more aligned to Europe and European values and European ways and European culture, the people on the eastern side felt more aligned with Eastern European, with Russia. They felt more in common with Russia. They might have been related, like I said in my last video, to Russia. So that creates a divide in the country in itself, because, and especially later on, once the country became a part of the Soviet Empire, and we're going to get to that in a minute. So the very fact that Ukraine is a border country, did I already mention, the name Ukraine actually means border country. And in some translations, it means like military border. So the very name Ukraine means border country. So the fact that it is a border country kind of separating east from west, with both of those wanting to expand, the Ukraine territory, the Ukraine country, has really been in the middle when you've got two big forces kind of pulling pieces away, ceding pieces back, putting pieces away. Okay, you can have this. Okay, you can have that. So they've really been in the crosshairs. They've really been in the middle of this battle between East and West for millennia, for a long, not millennia, but for centuries, for a long time. And then fast forward to the 1600s. I'm going to skip all kinds of back and forth and fighting and wars and Cossacks and all kinds of stuff. Oh no, but the 1600s. The Cossacks were actually ruling the land that is now Ukraine. And they ruled Ukraine, they were inhabiting Ukraine, they ruled Ukraine for a while and struck a healthy, non-confrontational balance between the East and the West. So the Ukraine was able to exist under Cossack rule for a while, with the west side of Ukraine having their Western alliances and allegiances, and the eastern side of Ukraine having their Rus or Russian Eastern allegiance and alliances. And for a while, the Cossacks were able to balance that, and things worked really well. Well, all of a sudden, a Cossack warlord came into power and took over and said, you know what, I want to make an independent Cossack state. I don't want any more of this, what's been going on. I want this to be all about Cossacks. And so what he did is he went to Russia and he formed an alliance with Russia. I'm going to form a Cossack state, probably through revolution, and I need your protection. So that's what he did. He signed a deal with Russia, with the East, and said, okay, I'm going to do this. Will you protect me? And also keep your hands off, basically is what he said. So this Cossack warlord signed this treaty with Russia, giving Ukraine, it was going to be a new Cossack state, its independence. Well, that didn't quite work out. Within 15 years, Russia went to Poland and made a deal behind the Cossacks' back to split Ukraine apart. So you see, this has been back and forth, back and forth. We could go through a dozen such deals that backfired, and people taking over and wanting to split up the Ukraine. So once again, the Ukraine was divvied up between the West and the East. Poland took part of it, Russia took part of it, and that's the way it stayed for quite a while. So they completely pushed out the Cossacks. They're like, yeah, you know what? We don't need you. Why did they start? There was a lot of, from the research that I did, historians kind of don't really understand that whole treaty to begin with. It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? It's like, hey, Cossack warlord is all, hey, Russia, let's sign a treaty. I get control and Ukrainian independence, and you protect me. I mean, it kind of makes no sense. So don't really know what that was about. So the backdoor deal between Russia and Poland to split Ukraine up. Fast forward a century or so, and all of a sudden, Poland and Lithuania powers start to diminish. They're not as powerful as they once were. They're not as strong as they once were. And so their hold on Ukraine kind of starts to wane. They start to lose control of their portion of Ukraine. So fast forward a century or so, I don't know, and all of a sudden, Russia is pretty much in control of all of the country of Ukraine. And so much so, in fact, that Catherine the Great was calling them Little Russians, and she was calling the Ukraine New Russia. It was New Russia. And in fact, she went so far to claim the Ukraine as Russian that she banned the Ukrainian language. They outlawed Ukrainian books, and they persecuted any Ukrainian nationalist intellectuals. So there was kind of a purge. They're like, yeah, okay, you know what? Yeah, sorry, I know you might like being Ukrainians, but you're Russians now. So shh, no more of that Ukrainian language and no more Ukrainian books. You're Russians now. So that was Catherine the Great. That continued all the way through the 20th century. And in fact, when Stalin came into power, he took it a step further in trying to fold the Ukraine into the Russian or the Soviet state. And millions of Ukrainians were murdered through a famine that he starved them out. He purposely starved them to death because he wanted to control. That was one of his ways of controlling and saying, yeah, okay, you belong to us now. So when World War II started, so all this time, all this time, Ukrainians are fighting for their independence. You've got the Polish fighting over them. You've got the Lithuanians fighting over them. You've got the Russians and Catherine the Great who are persecuting them for speaking their language and banning books, that are in their native language. And all this time, Ukraine, or at least half of Ukraine, right? Because you remember, you have split loyalties. You have the eastern part of Ukraine who might be happy to be part of the Russian Empire, but then you have the western part of Ukraine and Ukrainian people who enjoyed the life and the culture and the prosperity that they were having under more of a Western European influence. And so all this time still, the Ukrainians are fighting for independence. They wanted to be independent. At least half of the country always wanted independence. So there's always been a debate. There's always been like a push and pull. You've got the people in power who might be more inclined to pander to the Russians. When the Russians are taking over, they're like, yeah, okay, fine. Just don't, starve me out. So there's just been a lot of turmoil within the country, and half might want independence at a certain time. The other half might want independence at a certain time. So there's been a lot of back and forth and turmoil within the country. So now let's fast forward to World War II. In the beginning of World War II, Russia and Germany were allies. Stalin even helped Hitler with supplies and weapons and things like that. But that eventually fell apart. And when it did, the Ukraine saw an opportunity. They thought maybe they could petition Germany to help them out. They thought maybe if they could be on the side of Germany, they could finally gain their independence. They even carried out some purges of Polish people and participated in some Holocaust events and things like that, unfortunately, hoping that they could finally gain their independence from Russia. Of course, that didn't happen. That totally fell through. Germany lost the war, as we know. And things were a mess after World War II. So they pretty much took back their claim on the Ukraine, declaring them once again Little Russians, probably. I don't know if they did, actually. But so from then on out, throughout the Cold War, throughout post-World War II, under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was a country controlled by Moscow. And of course, half the population didn't like that. Half the population probably was okay with that. Half the population didn't like it. So when Yeltsin declared basically the end of the USSR in 1991, the Ukraine declared their independence. And once again, they had these split factions within the country of half who wanted to remain part of Russia and the other half who, on the Western side, felt like they were more European, felt like they wanted to be part of Europe instead of Eastern Europe or Russia. And they've pretty much since 1991, the Ukrainian people have seen revolution a couple of times, with the pro-Russian people and the pro-West people butting heads, and leaders who side with Russia, and then there's revolution to oust them. So, in researching this, it dawned on me, it makes sense that the Ukrainian people are on the streets, arming themselves, fighting against Russia. They're not strangers to revolution. Since, I don't know, over the last couple of decades, 3 decades, they've had a handful of revolutions, maybe not quite that many, for their independence from, a tug of war between we want to be aligned with Russia, we want to be aligned with the European Union, we want to be aligned with Russia, and so and their party system and their elections keep going back and forth, and sometimes people have gotten elected unfairly and they've redone elections. There's a lot of history there, and if you're interested, I highly recommend that you look into it, do some reading, or look at some videos about it. It's a very fascinating history. So I just wanted to give you, though, a really quick history of the Ukraine so that when Russia says, these are my people, you know, these are Russians. These really aren't Ukrainians. He even said Ukraine's not a country. That they're not a country. They're part of Russia. When he says that, now you know a little bit more about the history, so that you can decide whether Putin is lying. Yes, pretty much he is, or not. So I hope you found this helpful or interesting or fascinating. Leave your comments below, and I will have more videos coming out. Be sure to subscribe below. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.